The needle pricked her finger, and Eleanor did not flinch. A single drop of blood bloomed on the gray muslin she was mending, her own. In the winter garden of Ashfern Hall, the Duchess of Ashfern sat on a low stool, repairing the hem of her oldest morning gown, while Lady Augusta, the dowager, dictated the ball list aloud to a secretary. 300 names passed between them. Eleanor's was not among them. The plain ivory cameo at her throat caught the pale March light. Across the hall, in the copper-bright kitchen, Harriet heard Lady Prudence laugh into her teacup and call her mistress the mender. Eleanor heard it too. She bent again to the cloth. That same afternoon a horse came hard up the drive from Surrey. Lord Julian Ashford, Earl of Renthorpe, threw his riding glove onto the Duke's writing table and spoke without sitting. In the drawing rooms of Harrogate, he said, the Duke's own mother named his wife the mender before strangers. Sebastian Blackwood, the Ice Duke of Ashfern, did not answer. He only turned the signet ring on his finger, the lion and sword of his house catching the firelight. Later, by candle, old Whitaker opened the household ledger across the Duke's desk. 2 years and 4 months of red ink. Every request the young Duchess had ever made, a new shawl, a physician, a letter sent, struck through in his mother's hand, with 3 words beside each, unnecessary for a heart. The Duke closed the book very slowly. What he chose to do, 4 o'clock the following day, behind a curtain of green damask in the blue drawing room. Before the story begins, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of justice, dignity, and love that arrives against all odds move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. March of 1818 came damp to Ashfern Hall, and the rain on the leaded glass of the winter garden sounded like small coins being counted by a careful hand. Eleanor sat by the south window with a needle between her teeth, the hem of her gray muslin gown spread across her lap like a tired flag. She had already turned the seam twice. The thread, she suspected, would not last a third. She did not look up when the door opened. Lady Augusta entered first, as she always entered first, a column of black silk and starched lace that seemed to draw the warmth out of the room behind her. Lady Prudence followed, fanning herself though the morning was cold, the painted shepherdesses on her silk leaf already beginning to flake. Behind them, soundless, came Mr. Whitaker with the ledger and the inkstand. "Sit there, Whitaker." Lady Augusta did not point. The mere shape of her sentence pointed for her. "The light is better." Whitaker bowed half an inch and obeyed. He set the inkstand on the marquetry table with the patience of a man who has seen 40 winters of orders given to him as though he had never received the first. Eleanor pulled the needle through, set a small even stitch, and went on. "We shall begin with the Carstairs," Lady Augusta said. "Both branches, then the Pembroke twins, though I cannot abide the elder, then Lady Vauxhall, who must come early. She does so prefer to be observed arriving." Whitaker's quill scratched. The fire in the grate hissed once at a wet log and gave up. Mark Lord Renthorpe, of course, the Marchioness of Halford and her insufferable son, the bishop, for appearances, Lord and Lady Caroby. A pause. Not the daughter. "Mamma," murmured Lady Prudence, with the smile of a child being given sweets, "you are too cruel." "I am thorough," said Lady Augusta. "There is a difference," Eleanor set another stitch. The needle, dulled by years of household use, caught at the cloth and dragged. She did not sigh. She had learned, in 2 years and 4 months under this roof, that a sigh traveled further than a scream. The list continued. 40 names, 60. Whitaker's quill moved as steadily as a clock, and the room filled with the small civil sounds of a great house preparing to display itself. The patter of rain, the scrape of nib, the click of Lady Prudence's leaf opening and closing, as she counted on her fingers the gowns she had not yet ordered. Eleanor waited. She waited for her own name, as one waits for a coach known to be late. Lady Augusta reached the end of the queues and turned her head a careful degree toward the window, as though noticing for the first time that the air contained another person. "And the household," she said. "Whitaker, the household first names, please, on a separate sheet. Receiving line, eldest to youngest. My son, of course. Myself. Lady Prudence." The quill paused. Whitaker did not raise his eyes. "Your Grace," he said, very softly. "Shall I add? That is the household, Whitaker. 3 names. Be so good as to write 3. Eleanor's needle did not stop. It went in. It came out. A neat white thread closed a small gray wound in the muslin. Her hands belonged to someone else now, someone calm. Her face, she knew, would tell nothing, because she had spent the better part of a year teaching her face to tell nothing. Whitaker wrote 3 names. Lady Prudence, who had been waiting for it, gave a little laugh through her nose, as though a private joke had struck her. "How very tidy," she said. 3 is such a tidy number. "Hush," said her mother, without heat. The door behind them gave the cough of old hinges, and a maid in striped cotton put her head in. Harriet, freckles bright from the kitchen heat, her cap a little askew. Her eyes went first to Eleanor, as Harriet's eyes always did, and then to the floor, as a good servant's must. "If you please, my lady," she said to Lady Augusta. "Cook asks whether the seed cake is to be the great or the small." "The great," said Lady Augusta. "We are not a parsonage." Harriet bobbed. Her eye flicked once more, in passing, toward the window, toward Eleanor's bent head and the careful needle, and there was in that flicker a small fierce pity that Eleanor caught and quietly refused. She lifted her chin half an inch. "Not yet," the chin said. "Not here." Harriet, who had learned to read her mistress in less than a fortnight, withdrew. "That girl stares," said Lady Prudence. "That girl is Cornish," said Lady Augusta, as though this explained everything that need ever be explained about Harriet Dawes. The list resumed. Eleanor finished the hem, bit the thread, smoothed the muslin across her knee. The mending basket beside her held 3 more such tasks: a cuff parting from its sleeve, a sash worn at the buckle, a pair of evening gloves with the fingertip thinning, where her own ring had once been. She had no ring now. The little garnet her mother had pressed into her hand the morning of the wedding had gone, 6 months ago, to settle a wine bill her father could not pay, and she had not told her husband. She had not told anyone. The space on her finger had healed white and small, like a scar from a burn long forgotten. "The Renthorpes must be seated near my son," Lady Augusta was saying. "He grows restless among strangers. Put Lady Vauxhall on his left," Whitaker wrote. "And the receiving line?" he asked, with the gentleness of a man who already knew the answer, and asked only that the answer be spoken aloud once more, in his hearing, so that a witness existed. Lady Augusta did not look at Eleanor. "As I said, Whitaker, 3 names." Eleanor stood. She did it without flourish. She set the mended gown on the chair, settled the basket on the floor at her feet, and walked the length of the winter garden with the quiet step that the long galleries of Ashfern taught all its women in time. She paused at the table where Whitaker bent over his ledger, and she laid one finger, only the tip of one finger, on the corner of his paper, so lightly that the ink did not even tremble. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "when you have a moment, the linen press in the east corridor wants a second key. The cook's girls cannot reach the upper shelf." "Your Grace," said Whitaker, and the 2 words in his mouth were a full sentence. Eleanor inclined her head to Lady Augusta, the smallest, the most correct of curtsies, the precise degree owed to a dowager by the present duchess, and not a hair more, and went out by the garden door. Behind her, Lady Prudence's leaf clicked open again. "She does carry it off, doesn't she?" she said, sweetly. "The walking out, as though she had somewhere to walk to." "She has the linen press," said her mother. The leaf clicked shut on Lady Prudence's laugh. The garden door let her out onto the stone terrace, and the cold went into her shawl at once, looking for her bones. She did not pull the wool closer. To pull it closer would have been to admit that she was cold, and admission, in this house, was a coin you spent only when you were sure of the return. She walked the length of the terrace at the same pace she had crossed the winter garden, past the great urns with their dead geraniums, past the bench where, on certain mornings of her first month, she had sat and tried to read Cowper, and had got no further than the second page in any sitting, because the wind off the park kept turning the leaves for her, past the sundial whose Latin she had translated, alone, on a wet afternoon, "I count only the bright hours," and had thought, with the small grim humor that had begun to grow in her then, that here at Ashfern the sundial would be very honest indeed. At the end of the terrace she stopped. The park rolled away gray and brown, the long avenue of limes still bare, the stables a low, dark line beyond. Somewhere among those buildings her husband would be at this hour, walking out the bay mare he favored, his greatcoat black against the wet bark. She had seen him from this terrace 100 times and had never once raised a hand. He had never once raised one either. They passed one another like two ships that had been told, separately and at different ports, that the other was already lost. 2 years and 4 months. She counted them, sometimes, on her fingers under the table at dinner, when the silence at the long board grew so wide that counting felt like a kind of conversation. She had been 21 when she had come to him. She would be 24 in the summer. Between those two facts, very little. A wedding she remembered chiefly for the cold of the chapel. A wedding night she remembered chiefly for his bow at her chamber door. Very correct, very brief, and the click of the latch behind him. A breakfast the next morning at which his mother had passed her the salt without speaking, and his sister had asked her, in a voice of bright interest, whether her people in Devonshire kept pigs. She had not, that morning, known what to say. She had said yes. They had laughed. She had learned, after that, to say less. A door opened along the terrace, and Harriet came out with a folded shawl over one arm, the heavier one, the dark one with the fringe, and crossed to her at a pace that was almost, but not quite, hurrying. "Your Grace, you'll take a chill." Eleanor allowed the shawl to be laid over her shoulders. She allowed Harriet to tuck it at the collar. She did not turn her head. "What did you hear in the copper room, Harriet?" Harriet's hands stilled at her collar. "Your Grace, you came in to ask about a seed cake that the cook decided yesterday. You came in to look at me. What did you hear?" A silence. The wind moved in the bare limes. Harriet drew breath. "Lady Prudence? My lady? With her own maid? In the still room. Laughing. At what? At the list, my lady. Her ladyship had told her over breakfast." Harriet swallowed. She was telling Susan that there would be 3 Blackwoods receiving at the door of the ball, and that the 4th would be, say it, Harriet. "Would be in the linen press, my lady, counting sheets." Eleanor did not move. She felt the words settle, the way a stone settles in a deep well. First the strike, then the smaller answering rings outward, then nothing. The park did not change. The wind in the limes did not change. The bay mare, somewhere beyond the stables, made a small distant complaint about a girth, and her husband, somewhere beyond that, did not hear. "Thank you, Harriet." "My lady." "Thank you." Harriet, who had her orders even when no orders had been spoken, curtsied and went back along the terrace. At the door she paused and looked back, and her freckled face was set in a way that Eleanor would, in another month, learn to recognize as the face of a girl preparing to do something for which she had not been asked. For now, Eleanor only nodded her in. The door closed. She was alone on the stone. She held herself very straight, because there were windows behind her, and one never knew from which a face might be watching. She let the cold do its work in her shawl. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her a little, of the small white space on her ring finger, and of the wine bill in Devonshire, and of the seed cake, which would be great, and of Whitaker's quill writing 3 names. She did not cry. She had cried, twice, in her first month, and both times Lady Augusta had remarked at dinner upon the redness of her eyes and asked, with concern that hurt more than any insult, whether the country air did not perhaps disagree with her. Eleanor had learned, after the second time, that tears in this house were not received as sorrow. They were entered in a ledger of their own, under a different column, and used. So she did not cry. She walked instead. Back along the terrace, in by the garden door, through the winter garden, where Lady Augusta and Lady Prudence had moved on to the question of the supper service and did not look up. Past the table where Whitaker, bending lower than before, drew a very neat single line under the 3 names he had been told to write, and laid the page aside. Through the long picture gallery, where her husband's ancestors looked down at her without recognition, painted in the colors of better centuries. Up the small stair, along the east corridor, past the linen press whose second key she had not yet asked anyone to cut, into her own sitting room, which was small, and faced north, and contained a writing table, 2 chairs, a fireplace whose grate Harriet had blacked that morning, and on the mantel a single porcelain shepherdess with a chipped crook, the only ornament she had brought from her mother's house in Devonshire, and the only ornament Lady Augusta had not been able to discover a reason to remove. She closed the door. She sat down at the writing table. She drew toward her a sheet of cream paper, and she dipped the pen, and for a long moment she held it above the page without writing anything, watching a single drop of ink swell at the nib and choose, in the end, not to fall. She wiped the nib. She set the pen down. She opened the small drawer at her right hand, and she took out the household book in which, over 2 years and 4 months, she had set down, in her own clear hand, in pencil, never in ink, every requisition she had made for the running of her own apartments and her own person. A pair of stockings, a quire of writing paper, a half-pound of beeswax for the candlesticks in the small dining room she preferred for breakfast and which no one used, a new pane for the window above her bed, which had cracked in the November frost and let in the draught. Beside each entry, in another hand, bolder, in red, a single word stood: unnecessary, unnecessary, unnecessary for a heart. She had not, until this morning, asked herself who would one day read this book. She closed it. She laid her hand flat upon the cover, and she sat in the small north-facing room with the rain beginning again on the window, and she heard, very faintly, from the great hall below, the front bell ring once, and a man's boots cross the marble, and a voice, a cheerful, traveled voice, a voice that did not belong to this house, asking, with the easy authority of a friend, where in God's name His Grace was hiding this afternoon. Eleanor lifted her head. She did not yet know the name of the rider, or the color of his glove, or the courtane of green damask in the blue saloon behind which, in 3 days' time, her husband would stand for 40 minutes and not breathe. She knew only that the bell had rung. She set the household book back in the drawer, and she closed the drawer, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she waited, as a woman in a gray gown, in a great house, in the spring of 1818, had long since been taught to wait, for whatever the bell had brought. The bell had brought Lord Julian Ashford, Earl of Renthorpe, in a traveling cloak still beaded with the wet of the Surrey road. He did not wait to be announced. He crossed the marble of the front hall in 7 long strides, handed his beaver hat to a startled footman without looking at him, and went directly up the great stair toward the east wing, where the Duke of Ashfern kept his private study. Whitaker, descending with a tray of cold tea, stepped aside against the wall and inclined his head a fraction of an inch. Lord Julian did not slow. "Is he in?" "His Grace is at the ledgers, my lord." "Good." Julian did not knock. He pushed the heavy oak door open with the flat of his hand and let it swing wide against the bookcase. Sebastian Blackwood looked up from a long column of figures, a steel pen suspended above the page. He did not rise. He did not greet his oldest friend with anything that resembled welcome. He set the pen in the inkstand with the small, exact motion of a man who disliked interruption, and disliked, more, the suspicion that the interruption was warranted. Renthorpe. Ashfern. Julian crossed to the desk. He did not sit. He drew off one yellow duskin glove, then the other, and he laid them across the open ledger, with a precision that was almost insolent. The leather still held the cold of the road. A drop of rain ran down the cuff of his blue coat and darkened the page beneath. Sebastian glanced at the gloves. He did not move them. "You ride hard for a man who has no quarrel with me." "I have a quarrel with your house." "That is not the same thing." "It will be," Julian said, "by the time I have finished." He turned then and walked the length of the carpet to the window. The park below lay gray and sodden, the elms black against a sky the color of pewter. He spoke without turning back. "I came from Harrogate this morning. I broke a horse to do it. I would have broken 2. "Then speak." Julian turned. His face, which was the face of an easy man, of a man who laughed in drawing-rooms and bowed neatly to dowagers, was not easy now. The mouth had set itself in a flat line. The blue eyes had gone very dark. "I sat at my mother's tea on Tuesday last. Lady Carmody was there. Mrs. Penhallow was there. The Honorable Mrs. Whitcomb was there. And your mother, Sebastian. Your mother was there, in the chair by the fire, with that black lace at her throat and that ivory leaf fan she carries on a cord. And they were speaking of your wife." Sebastian did not answer. A small muscle moved once in the line of his jaw and was still. "They were not speaking kindly. My mother is not, in general, kind. Do not be clever with me. Not today. Julian came back across the room. He set both hands flat on the edge of the desk and leaned in, and the candle between them shivered with the small displacement of air. Your mother called her the mender. Sebastian's eyes did not move. Lady Carmody asked after the new Duchess of Ashfern, politely, as one does, and your mother smiled the smile she keeps for it and said, "Oh, you mean the mender. We do not, at Ashfern, call her the Duchess. The household has found its own name for her. She sits with her needle by the long window and mends what cannot be mended, poor creature, and she does it so quietly one nearly forgets she is in the room." And the ladies laughed, Sebastian. They laughed behind their fans. And your sister Prudence, who had ridden in for the day, leaned across and added, in that bright voice of hers, "Mama is too generous. We call her the upholstery. She matches the chairs." The room held very still. Sebastian's hand, which had been resting open on the page, closed slowly. The signet on his smallest finger caught the candlelight once, the lion and the sword, and went dark again against the leather. You heard this yourself. With both ears, sober, at 11 in the morning, over bohea tea, in my mother's yellow drawing room. I am telling you what was said, in the words it was said, because you will hear it whispered now in every house from Berkeley Square to Bath, and you will hear it last, because no one will tell the Duke of Ashfern to his face that his Duchess is a joke in his own mother's mouth. Sit down, Renthorpe. I will not sit down. Sit down. Julian sat. He sat the way an angry man sits, on the edge of the chair, both feet planted. He did not take up the small glass of sherry Whitaker had set out an hour before. He looked at his friend across the desk, and his voice, when he spoke again, had dropped into the lower register he used only in earnest. Sebastian, I have known you since Eton. I stood at your side when you married her. I watched her come up that aisle in a gown she had cut down from her mother's, with her hands trembling on her father's arm, and I watched you take her hand, and I thought, well, he has done a decent thing. He has saved a decent house from ruin and given a decent girl a roof. I did not expect a love match. I did not ask for one. But I thought, at the least, you would shelter her. She is sheltered. She is not. She has every comfort this house affords. She has every comfort your mother permits her to have, which, I am beginning to understand, is none. Sebastian rose then. He walked to the long window. He stood with his back to the room, one hand at the small of his back, the other resting lightly against the cold pane. The rain had begun again in earnest. He watched a single drop run the length of the glass. My mother manages the household. Your mother runs your wife into the ground and you have not noticed. I notice what is brought to me. And what precisely is brought to you? Have you sat at table with your Duchess this fortnight? Have you walked the South Gallery with her? Have you asked her how she takes her tea? The window glass was very cold beneath Sebastian's fingertips. He did not answer. I thought not. Julian leaned back at last. He drew a long breath. When he spoke again, the heat had gone out of his voice. What was left was something colder and more useful. Listen to me, Ashfern. I did not ride 2 counties to scold you. Scolding is my mother's vocation, not mine. I rode here because there is a thing you must do, and I do not believe you will do it on the strength of my telling alone. You are too well bred and too well trained, and you will sit at that desk and you will say, in that voice of yours, I shall speak to my mother, and you will speak to her, and she will weep 3 tears into that black lace, and she will tell you that Eleanor is delicate, and the ladies of the Ton are unkind, and she is doing her best, and you will believe her, because she is your mother, and because believing her is easier than the alternative. What is the alternative? That she has been lying to you for 2 years and 4 months. The number landed with a small, precise weight. Sebastian turned from the window. Why that number? Ask Whitaker. He will know to the day. I am told by my mother's lady's maid, who is a sister to your Mrs. Dawes, that there is a household ledger in which every requisition your Duchess has signed has been struck out by your mother's hand in red ink with the words, unnecessary for a heart. Every shawl, every pair of gloves, every yard of muslin, every coal scuttle for her sitting room in February, every candle past 9 o'clock. I am told further, by the same source, that your wife mends her own gowns at the window because she has been given no others, and that the mending is the joke that travels. Sebastian's face did not move. The face was a thing he had been trained to from the age of 7, but the hand at his side opened and closed once, very slowly, and Julian, who knew him, saw it. "You will not believe me," Julian said, "on the strength of a tea, so I have come to tell you to see it for yourself. Speak. Tomorrow is Thursday. On Thursdays, your mother takes tea at 4 in the Blue Salon with Lady Prudence and 3 of the dragons of the season. They sit on the long sofa beneath the canaletto. Your Duchess is required to be present and to pour. She is required, further, to remain silent unless addressed, and she is rarely addressed. Be in the Blue Salon at 5 minutes to 4. Stand behind the green damask curtain at the south window. Do not cough, do not move, stay until the clock chimes the half. If at the end of 40 minutes you can sit at this desk and tell me that what I have said is the malice of a tired earl who slept badly on the Surrey road, I shall apologize and ride out by morning. You ask me to spy on my own mother. I ask you to listen to your own wife." Sebastian was silent for a long moment. "There is a difference," he said at last, "between believing a thing and witnessing it." "There is. That is precisely why I am telling you to witness it." Julian rose. He took up his gloves from the ledger. Beneath them, on the page, the rain had left a small dark stain across a column of farm rents at Bramley. He drew the gloves on, finger by finger. "I shall ride back to Renthorpe tonight. I have an estate to mind and a mother of my own to disappoint. But I shall tell you this, Sebastian, and then I shall be done. You married a girl who had nothing left but her name and the gown on her back. You stood before God and the bishop and you said you would honor her. You have not honored her. You have housed her. Those are not the same word, and any decent man knows it." "I know it. Then prove that you know it. 4 o'clock. Green curtain. South window. Do not be late." He bowed, briefly, in the formal way one bowed at the close of business, and he went to the door. There he paused, with one hand on the heavy brass, and he did not turn his head. "Your wife," he said, "is by all accounts a quiet creature. I have not exchanged 6 sentences with her in 2 years, but the lady's maid tells me she sat through a butcher's bill being thrown in her lap at breakfast and folded the paper neatly and ate her toast. A woman who can do that has a spine, Ashfern. You have married a spine and you have not noticed. That is a worse waste, I think, than the gloves." He went out. The door closed behind him with the small, precise click of a well-hung latch. Sebastian Blackwood did not move for a full minute. Then he walked, slowly, to the desk. He sat. He looked at the small dark stain the rain had left on his ledger. He looked at the candle, which was burning a little uneven now in the draught from the closing door. He looked at the signet on his smallest finger. He had not, in fact, sat at table with his Duchess in 11 days. He counted backward. 11. There had been the parliamentary supper on Tuesday last, the dinner at White's, the long Wednesday with the steward at Bramley over the drainage of the lower fields, the Friday at the house, the Saturday at his club, the Sunday at chapel, where Eleanor had sat 3 rows ahead with his mother, and he had bowed to the back of her plain straw bonnet and gone home in a separate carriage, because his mother had said the second was easier on her hip. 11 days. He had nodded to his wife at chapel. He had not spoken to her since the Monday before that, when she had asked him, at breakfast, whether he had any preference as to the menus for the week, and he had said, without looking up from the Times, that the menus were entirely her affair. The menus, he understood now, were not entirely her affair. The menus were not her affair at all. He rose. He went to the bell pull beside the chimney. He gave it one short, definite tug. Whitaker appeared in the doorway, as though he had been waiting in the corridor, which he had. "Your Grace." "Whitaker, be so good as to bring me the household book." The current quarter and the 3 before it. A small thing crossed the old butler's face. It was gone before a man less practiced might have caught it. But Sebastian, watching now, caught it. A flicker that was not surprise, and not relief, but something closer to the recognition of a debt long owed, and at last asked for. "At once, Your Grace." "Anne Whitaker, Your Grace. Tomorrow afternoon, at 3:45, I shall require the south window of the Blue Salon to be open 1 inch behind the green damask. The curtain is to be drawn full. The room is to be unaware that I have entered it." The old man's eyes met his, very steadily, for the smallest portion of a second. "It shall be as Your Grace wishes." Thank you, Whitaker. Your Grace. He went out. Sebastian sat alone in the study, while the rain ran down the long window and the candle guttered once and steadied. He thought, with the strange, clear quiet that sometimes followed shame, of a morning 2 years past when he had stood in the small chapel at Hartcourt and watched a thin girl in a cut-down gown lift her gray eyes to his and say, in a voice that did not tremble though her hands did, "I will." He had thought then, with the cool charity of a man doing a decent thing, that he had given her a roof. He understood now that a roof was not a kindness. A roof was a wall and a ceiling. What he had given her, between the wall and the ceiling, was his mother. He took up his pen. He drew a fresh sheet of paper toward him. He did not, yet, write anything. He sat with the pen poised and the ink drying on the nib, and he listened, as a man listens who has not, in a very long while, troubled to listen, to the sound of his own house, the rain on the slates, the distant clink of a coal scuttle in some corridor, and, very faintly, from 2 stories below and 3 rooms east, the small, unmistakable sound of a woman laughing behind a fan. He laid the pen down. He rose once more and crossed to the long window. The park was darker now. A groom led a chestnut mare across the gravel toward the stable yard, and the mare shook her head against the rain, and the small, bright sound of her bridle came up faintly through the closed glass. Sebastian watched her go. He thought of the broken horse Julian had ridden across 2 counties. He thought of his own stables, full and warm and oiled, and of the 11 days, and of a butcher's bill folded neatly on a breakfast plate. A small heat began, at last, behind his ribs. It was not yet anger. Anger would come tomorrow, at 4 o'clock, behind a green curtain. What he felt now was the colder thing that comes first, the knowledge of having been, for 2 years and 4 months, a fool in his own house. Tomorrow, at 4 o'clock, he would stand behind a green curtain in his own salon, in his own house, in the spring of 1818, and he would learn what kind of man he had been. The rain had stopped by dawn, but the gravel of the front drive still glistened black when Sebastian came down the great staircase 3 hours earlier than was his habit. He had not slept. The candle in his study had burned to a stub against a stack of estate papers he had not read, and somewhere between the 3rd hour and the 4th, he had decided that he would not wait until 4 o'clock to begin learning what kind of man he had been. He would begin at once, with the only instrument in the house that could not lie to him. He found Whitaker already at the sideboard in the small breakfast room, pouring coffee for no one. "Whitaker, Your Grace, the household ledgers, every book kept by my mother since the wedding, bring them to the library." The old butler set the silver pot down with a care that suggested he had been expecting this summons for some time. "All of them, Your Grace?" "All." "Very good." He did not ask why. He bowed, withdrew, and within 20 minutes returned with 2 footmen behind him, each carrying a stack of bound volumes that reached the chin. The books were heavy, black buckram things stamped in blind with the Ashfern arms, and they made a soft thunder when laid upon the long mahogany table beneath the south windows. 7 volumes, 2 years and 4 months of domestic accounting, kept in the dowager's own clerical hand because Lady Augusta had, on the morning after the wedding, declared that the new Duchess had not the experience to oversee a house of such consequence. Sebastian had signed that declaration without reading it. He remembered the pen. He remembered his mother's gloved finger laid beside the line. He did not remember Eleanor being in the room. "Sit, Whitaker." "Your Grace, it is not—" "Sit." The butler hesitated, then drew out a chair opposite and sat with the rigid composure of a man who had served 3 dukes and never once been invited to share a table with any of them. His white-gloved hands rested flat on the wood. His pale eyes did not move from the duke's face. "You have kept these books," Sebastian said. "Her ladyship has kept them, Your Grace. I have only countersigned the weekly tallies, as the office of butler requires. And you have read them." A pause. "It is my duty to read what I countersign." "Then read them to me now. Begin with the first volume. Begin with the month after the wedding." Whitaker drew the topmost book toward him with both hands. He opened it at the silk marker that had been laid, Sebastian noticed, with the deliberate flatness of a marker placed long ago and never disturbed. The page was clean, 2 columns, requisitions on the left in a thin, sloping copper plate, approvals on the right in the dowager's heavier, blacker script. Down the right-hand column, again and again, ran a single short stroke in red ink. The first entry, Your Grace, is dated the 11th of November, year 15. A request from Her Grace for 3 yards of cambric and a paper of needles to mend the linen brought from Hart Court. Approved? Struck through, Your Grace. By whose hand? Lady Augusta's. The marginal note reads, unnecessary for a heart. The linen may be discarded. Sebastian's hand, resting on the table, became very still. Continue. The 14th of November. A request for a small fire to be kept in Her Grace's dressing room of an evening, the chimney drawing poorly and the room being north-facing. Approved? Struck through. Marginal note. Unnecessary for a heart. A shawl will suffice. Continue. The 2nd of December. A request for the services of Mr. Pemberton, the local apothecary, Her Grace being troubled by a cough. Struck through? Struck through. Note. Unnecessary for a heart. The kitchen may brew honey and thyme. Continue. The 19th of December. A request to engage a music master from Harrogate, Her Grace expressing a wish to resume her studies upon the pianoforte. Struck through. Note. Unnecessary for a heart. The instrument in the morning room is sufficient instruction. That instrument is out of tune by a third. Yes, Your Grace. Continue. It took an hour to read the first volume. Whitaker's voice was even, low, almost liturgical. He did not pause for emphasis, and he did not soften a single phrase. The red strokes ran down every page like a thin artery. Cambric. A pair of leather house shoes when her old ones split. A subscription to the lending library at Hartwell. 6 shillings for the parish poor box on the morning of her saint's day. A length of black crepe for the 2nd anniversary of her mother's death. Each request small. Each request struck. Each marginal note the same 5 words, repeated until the words ceased to be language and became a kind of bell. Unnecessary for a heart. Sebastian listened without moving. At some point, the morning light had shifted across the table. The volume Whitaker now held was lit along its spine in a band of pale gold. The Duke watched the gold creep, inch by inch, toward the butler's hand, and he kept his face still by an effort that grew, by the 2nd volume, almost intolerable. He had not known. That was the thing his mind kept returning to, the way a man returns to a step that is loose on a staircase he has climbed for years. He had not known. He had signed the household papers without reading them because his mother had told him, in the soft voice she used only for her son, that domestic accounting was beneath the dignity of a duke. He had believed her. He had believed her because believing her had cost him nothing. It had cost Eleanor a fire in winter. Volume 3, Your Grace. Continue. The 8th of February, year 16. A request from Her Grace for the dowager's gowns of the previous season to be opened and recut, her own traveling wardrobe having proved unsuitable for the climate of the north. Approved? Struck through. Note. The gowns of a Blackwood are not for the alteration of a heart. Her Grace may make do with what she brought. What did she bring? 4 day gowns, Your Grace. 2 of muslin, 1 of merino, 1 of gray poplin. The last has been turned twice. Harriet showed me the seams in March. Turned twice? Yes, Your Grace. There was a silence. Outside the long windows, a thrush began to sing in the yew walk. 3 clear notes repeated, and the ordinary brightness of the sound was so out of proportion to the room that Sebastian for a moment did not know what he was hearing. Whitaker. Your Grace, did she ever come to you? The butler did not pretend not to understand. He looked, for the first time that morning, away from his master's face, and the small motion of his eyes was the only liberty he permitted himself. Once, Your Grace, in the November of the first year, she came to the still room as I was counting candles. She asked, very quietly, whether it would be improper for a duchess to mend her own linen rather than send it to the laundry having returned her shifts unaccountably scorched on 3 occasions. Scorched? Yes, Your Grace. And you said? I said that nothing a duchess chose to do in her own apartments could be called improper, and that I would have a work basket sent up that evening. Did you send it? I sent it. Did my mother know? By the following morning, Your Grace. And the basket? Was returned to the housekeeper's room with a note that the new duchess required no such instruments, being already abundantly supplied. Was she? No, Your Grace. Harriet has bought her needles from her own wages these 2 years. The Duke laid both his hands flat on the table. The signet ring on his right hand made a small, distinct sound against the wood. He looked down at it. The lion and the sword. He had worn it since his father's death at 26. He had never, in 8 years, considered what it weighed. Continue, Whitaker. Volume 4, Your Grace. The Summer of Year 16. There begins, in this volume, a second category of entry. Her Grace ceased, after the May of that year, to request anything for her own person. What does she request? Articles for the household, Your Grace, a new hymnal for the chapel, a subscription to the parish school, coal for the gatekeeper's lodge, his wife being lately confined, linen for the sick room when the under-housemaid took the fever, each entry small, each entry in her hand. Struck through? Some struck, some approved at half the sum requested, none refused outright. Her ladyship is, in this volume, more careful. The marginal notes become shorter. By the autumn, they are only initials. A.B. for approved at her ladyship's discretion. The discretion is always downward. And for herself she asks nothing. Nothing, Your Grace. For 2.5 years she has asked nothing for herself. Nothing, Your Grace. Sebastian rose. He crossed to the window. The thrush had stopped singing. In the yew walk, a gardener was raking the gravel into the neat parallel lines that the dowager required. His back bent, his breath rising in a slow plume on the spring air. Beyond him, on the terrace, a small figure in gray poplin was walking very slowly along the low balustrade, one hand trailing on the stone. Eleanor. She carried a wicker basket on her other arm. Sebastian could not, at this distance, see what was in it, but he could see the careful, hoarding way she held it close to her ribs, the way a child holds a thing it is half afraid will be taken. He watched her for a long moment without moving. Then he turned. Whitaker? The volumes. Bring them to my study and lock them in the cabinet behind the Holbein. The key remains with me. No footman is to know they have been moved. My mother is not to know that they have been read. Very good, Your Grace. And the books from this day forward. Your Grace? They are no longer to be kept in her hand. They are to be kept in yours and countersigned by me. Every Friday. Every request from her Grace, every request, is to be brought to me before any pen touches it. You will tell my mother, when she asks, that I have decided to take an interest in the accounts. You will tell her nothing else. Very good, Your Grace. One thing more. Your Grace, her Grace's old shifts, the ones that were scorched. A pause. I believe they are still in the linen press of the south wing, Your Grace. Harriet kept them as patterns for the mending. Have them brought to me. To Your Grace? To me. Today. Wrapped in paper. Whitaker. I wish to see what was done. The butler bowed. Something passed across his pale eyes that was not quite satisfaction, but was perhaps the next thing to it. The small, clean light of a man who has carried a weight in silence for 28 months and felt, in a single morning, the first hand laid beside his own upon the load. Very good, Your Grace. He gathered the volumes. The 2 footmen, summoned from the hall, took the heavier stacks. Sebastian stood by the window until the room was empty, and then he stood by the window a little longer, watching the gray figure on the terrace until she turned, lifted her basket once as if to settle its weight, and went in by the orangery door without looking up at the library windows. She did not know he was there. She had never expected in this house that anyone would be watching from a high window for her sake. He thought of the cambric, the 3 yards, the needles. He thought of the dressing-room fire that had not been lit through the winter of 15, while he had sat in his own apartments at the other end of the house, with a hearth piled high enough to roast a boar, and had never thought to ask whether the corresponding hearth in her rooms drew at all. He had asked her, once, in February of that first year, whether she was warm enough. She had said yes. He had been satisfied with the yes. He had not asked whether the yes was true. He understood now, with a clarity that was almost a physical pain behind the eyes, that for 2 years and 4 months his wife had been answering yes to questions he had not troubled to ask in earnest, and that every yes had cost her something, and that the cost had been kept in a black buckram ledger in his own house, in his own mother's hand, under his own roof, and signed week after week by the small white-gloved hand of an old man who had not been permitted to refuse. He sat down at the long table. The wood was warm where the morning sun had lain on it. He put his face into his hands for the space of one breath. No longer. because a duke does not weep in his own library at 10 in the morning. And then he lifted his head and he began, very deliberately, to plan. By the time Whitaker returned that afternoon with a flat parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, the Duke had already written 3 letters. The first was to his solicitor in Lincoln's Inn, requesting the immediate forwarding of the original marriage settlement and of the deed by which the household accounts had, in November of 15, been placed under the Dowager's hand. The second was to his banker in the Strand, requesting a full statement of the sums disbursed from the Hart dowry of £12,000 since the date of the wedding, together with the names of every account into which any portion of that sum had been transferred. The third was a single line, sealed and unaddressed, that he placed in the inner drawer of his desk and did not yet send. He undid the twine of Whitaker's parcel himself. The paper crackled. Inside lay 3 folded shifts of fine cambric, the linen worn soft, the embroidered cipher at the hem half effaced by washing. Across the breast of each, a brown iron-shaped mark had been burned through the cloth. The marks were identical. They had not been the work of an inexperienced laundress. They had been laid down with the precise center of a hot smoothing iron, 3 times, by a hand that had known exactly what it was doing. Sebastian looked at the marks for a long time. Then he refolded the shifts with the care of a man handling evidence at an inquest, retied the parcel, and set it in the locked cabinet behind the Holbein beside the 7 black volumes. He glanced at the clock on the chimney-piece. 3:15. He rose, drew his coat smooth, and went down through the long gallery toward the blue salon, where the green damask curtain hung in its heavy folds beside the south window, and the 4 o'clock light was already beginning to gather behind the glass. He took his place behind the curtain at 20 minutes to the hour. He heard, almost at once, the small, dry cough of his mother in the corridor beyond, and the lighter step of Prudence, and the low laughter of 3 voices he did not know. He waited. The signet ring on his hand was warm. Whatever he had been for 28 months, he would not be for an hour longer. At 10 minutes to 4, Sebastian crossed the long gallery on the soles of his Hessian boots, careful that the heels not strike the parquet. He had sent Whitaker ahead with a single instruction: draw no curtain, light no extra candle. Let the blue salon look exactly as it always looked at the hour of afternoon tea. The blue salon lay at the end of the gallery, its tall double doors standing ajar. He slipped inside without disturbing them and went directly to the green damask curtain that framed the deep bay window facing the south lawn. The curtain fell in heavy folds from a brass rod 10 feet above the floor. Behind it, a narrow stone embrasure cut into the thickness of the old wall, wide enough for a man to stand sideways. He had hidden there as a boy of 7, the first time his father had whipped a footman in this room. He had not stood in it since. He stepped into the embrasure and let the curtain fall. The damask smelled of dust and beeswax, and the faint lavender Eleanor laid in every linen press of the house. He did not move. He scarcely breathed. The long case clock in the gallery struck 4. Footsteps came first, light and quick. A door opened at the far end of the salon, the small service door used by the mistress. He knew the step. Eleanor entered alone. He heard the soft scrape of her sapphire-less slippers on the inlay, the rustle of dust-gray muslin, the chink of a teaspoon set on a saucer. She was setting the table herself. 3 months a duchess, and still she would not summon Harriet for what she believed to be a task of welcome. She crossed near the curtain. He could have reached out and touched her shoulder through the damask. She paused, perhaps a yard from him, and let out a small breath that was not quite a sigh. Then she moved on. The double doors opened. "My dear, you are late," said Lady Augusta, "and your hair is a fright." "Forgive me, Mamma." Eleanor's voice was even. "The post from Surrey came in only an hour ago. I attended to it." "The post?" Lady Augusta let the word hang as though it were a smell. "How industrious." "Lady Sefton, do come in. Lady Cowper. Lady Vauxhall. You will forgive the disarray. We keep a quiet house since the late Duke." Sebastian heard the answering murmurs of 3 women, whose names ruled every drawing-room between Berkeley Square and St. James's. He heard the soft creak of stays, the whisper of silk over satin. He heard his sister's laugh, that low private laugh she kept for the moment after a door closed. "And this," said Prudence, "is our dear sister." "Charmed," said Lady Sefton, in the voice she used for tradesmen's wives. "I do not believe we have been presented." "No," said Lady Augusta. She does not go out. A pause. The pause stretched. Eleanor said, I am very glad to receive you here, my ladies. Will you take tea? By all means, said Lady Cowper. The chairs creaked. The tea things rang. Sebastian heard the small, precise sounds of Eleanor pouring, of cups passed, of sugar dropped with tongs. For perhaps 2 minutes the conversation was nothing. Weather, roads from London, the new pavement at Burlington Arcade. Then Lady Augusta opened her fan. Lady Vauxhall, I am so relieved you have agreed to act as hostess for the ball. The dear Duchess has not, you understand, been brought up to the thing. Her father was a baronet of the older sort. Country. Quite, said Lady Vauxhall. We do not begrudge her, said Prudence brightly. She does her little tasks so prettily. Why, only yesterday she mended one of the morning curtains herself, with her own needle. Was it not, dear? It was a small tear, said Eleanor. Mended it like a seamstress, said Prudence to Lady Sefton, behind her fan. Not behind it enough. We call her our little mender. It is quite an affection. Lady Sefton's laugh was a single soft note, polite, finished. Sebastian's hand closed on the stone of the embrasure. He felt the cold edge of it bite into his palm and welcomed the pain because it kept him still. The hearts of Renthorpe, said Lady Augusta, in the tone of a woman reading a list of debts, were a respectable family in their day. The grandfather, I am told, sat in the house until the gout took him. The father, of course, lost everything at cards. Sir Reginald lives now in a cottage of 4 rooms at Marlow. We do not speak of it in front of the servants. You are too delicate, Mamma, said Prudence. One must be delicate, child. One has obligations. A cup was set down. Eleanor's cup. Sebastian knew the small, definite sound of her placing a thing exactly where she meant it to go. More tea, Lady Cowper? Thank you, dear. Then, to Lady Augusta, lower. She speaks very prettily. Where was she finished? At home, said Lady Augusta. By a governess who also taught the curate's daughters. One does what one can with the material to hand. The laughter that followed was the small, considerate laughter of women who would repeat the line at 4 other houses before the week was out. Sebastian counted the voices. 3 guests laughing. His mother not laughing. She did not stoop to laugh at her own jokes. His sister laughing, the same low, private laugh, and Eleanor silent. Tell us, Duchess, said Lady Vauxhall, kindly, perhaps with the intention of mercy. Do you ride? A little. I had a pony as a girl. A pony? Prudence covered her mouth. Oh, forgive me. My mare was sold, said Eleanor, when my father required the funds. Quite so, said Lady Augusta. We must find you something gentle from the Ashfern stables, something old and used to a timid hand. I am not timid in the saddle, Mamma. Of course not, dear. The conversation moved on, or seemed to. They spoke of Almack's, of vouchers withheld and granted, of a Miss Lacey who had run off with her uncle's chaplain. Eleanor poured a second round of tea. Sebastian listened to the careful clink of porcelain and counted the slow strikes of the half-hour and the quarter beyond. 40 minutes, he thought afterwards. 40 minutes of a tea by which 2 women dismantled a third in front of 3 witnesses, while the third refilled their cups. Twice Eleanor was permitted to speak, and twice she said something brief and useful and was answered as one answers a child who has volunteered the date. Once Lady Cowper, who was not unkind, asked whether the Duchess intended to open the long gallery for the ball. Before Eleanor could reply, Lady Augusta said, Lady Vauxhall will see to all such questions. The Duchess has not the experience. I had thought, said Eleanor, very quietly, to receive the guests beside my husband. The silence that fell was the only silence of the afternoon that Sebastian could not read. Then Lady Augusta laughed, once, dry as paper. Beside the Duke, my dear, we shall see. Prudence dropped her voice to the half-confiding pitch women use when they wish a thing to carry. She means well, you know. She does try, but one cannot put a sparrow in a peacock's place and ask the garden to admire it. Prudence, said Lady Sefton gently. Oh, she does not mind. Do you, dear? You know we are all sisters here. I do not mind, Prudence, said Eleanor. Sebastian heard the lie. He heard it in the precise placing of the word prudence, in the breath taken before it, in the absence of any softening dear. He had heard her use exactly that voice once, on the day she had signed the marriage register, and told the curate she was content. A A small bell rang at the far door. Whitaker, by arrangement, would be entering now with fresh hot water. Eleanor would have a moment in which she might withdraw if she chose. She did not choose. She remained, and poured, and was spoken about as though she were the urn. It was then that Lady Augusta delivered the sentence. She did not raise her voice. She lowered it, as a woman lowers a knife to a meat that will not need much pressure. She leaned, Sebastian guessed, towards Lady Vauxhall, in the manner of a confidence shared between equals over the head of a third party. "My son," she said, "still weeps for the true Duchess. This one is only the bookkeeper of the library." The teacup in Eleanor's hand did not ring. That was how he knew the depth of the cut. A woman struck through the chest does not drop the cup. She sets it down with both hands. He heard the second hand come up. He heard the cup placed on the saucer, perfectly square, perfectly silent. "My ladies," said Eleanor, "you will forgive me. I find I have a letter that cannot wait." "Of course, dear," said Lady Cowper, too quickly. "Run along," said Lady Augusta. The skirts of gray muslin passed within a foot of the curtain. He felt the small displacement of air. She did not pause this time. The door at the end of the salon opened, closed, and Eleanor was gone. Behind her, the laughter began before the latch had finished its click. Prudence laughed first, then Lady Vauxhall, then, more reluctantly, Lady Sefton. Lady Cowper did not laugh. Lady Augusta did not laugh. She only spoke, in her ordinary tone, of the difficulties of the Cornwall roads. Sebastian did not move. He could not have moved. He stood in the embrasure with his palm on the cold stone and felt the slow, steady drum of his own pulse. And a thing he had not felt in 11 years rose in him with the patience of a tide. It was not rage. Rage was a color. This was a temperature. It was the cold at which a man at last decides. He waited a quarter of an hour longer, until the women rose and the chairs were pushed back, and the doors closed behind them, and the salon was empty but for the smell of bergamot and ash. Then he stepped from behind the curtain and walked, without haste, the length of the gallery, the length of the great staircase, the length of the lower passage, until he reached the library. Whitaker was there, as instructed, standing by the cold fireplace, with his hands folded behind him. The two men looked at each other for a long moment. "You heard?" said Sebastian. "Through the service hatch, Your Grace. Every word." "Good. Lord Renthorpe is in the small study. He arrived 10 minutes ago. Send him in, and bring me the household book, the full ledger, 2 years and 4 months, every entry, and the brass key to my mother's strong cabinet in the dowager wing." Whitaker's eyes, which had been steady, became something else. "The strong cabinet, Your Grace? The one in which she keeps the sapphire parure my grandmother left to the wife of the 3rd Duke. I want the key on my desk before dinner." "Your Grace, the dowager keeps that key on her own person. Then I shall ask her for it, tonight, quietly, once." "Yes, Your Grace." Sebastian crossed to the long writing table and laid both hands flat upon it and looked down at his own hands as though they belonged to another man. The signet ring caught the late light and threw a small lion across the wood. "Whitaker, Your Grace, my wife, where is she now?" "In the morning room, Your Grace. She has rung for paper and a fresh pen. She did not ring for tea." "Was she weeping?" "No, Your Grace. She was very composed." Sebastian closed his eyes. Of course she was. He had married a woman who set down her cup with both hands. "Lord Renthorpe," he said. "Now." Julian came in with his gloves still on, his face hard with a question he did not need to ask. He shut the door behind him with the heel of his boot. "You heard her say it?" "Word for word." "Then we are past the part where you wonder whether I was unjust." "We are past it." "Good," said Julian. "Because there are 3 things you must do before midnight, and I have spent the carriage ride from Surrey listing them. May I sit?" "Sit. Speak." Julian sat. He drew off his gloves slowly, as a man buys himself a clear minute of thought. "First, the household ledger. You will not confront the dowager on hearsay. You will confront her on figures. Whitaker will mark every entry she struck in red ink and write beside it the date and the requisition. By tomorrow noon you must hold in your hand a document a magistrate would call evidence. Done. He is fetching it. Second, the dowry. You signed the settlements 2 years and 4 months ago. £12,000, paid in full by Sir Reginald's brother-in-law, on the morning of the wedding, lodged with Coutts in trust for the Duchess's personal use. Has she ever drawn upon it? I do not know. I do. I asked your steward in Surrey on the way north. Not a shilling, not a penny piece. Your mother holds the trust papers and signs for every disbursement to the household, and the Duchess has been told, in writing, that the income is committed to estate repairs at Renthorpe Hollow, which it is not. Sebastian was very still. Continue. Third, the ball. It is in 9 days. Your mother has already drafted the card of presentation, and Lady Vauxhall will stand at the head of the receiving line. You will let it stand. I will not. You will, Sebastian, until the night itself. Let her believe she has won. Let her draft her cards. Let her tell the ton that the Duchess has retired indisposed. And on the night, you will walk down the great staircase with your wife on your arm and announce, before 200 witnesses, every figure in that ledger and every shilling of that dowry. You will not raise your voice. You will not draw a sword. You will read. The two men looked at one another across the writing table. It will end them, said Sebastian. It will end them socially, legally, and financially, said Julian, which is the only ending the ton recognizes. The rest is sermon. Sebastian sat down at last in his father's chair. He laid his palms once more on the desk. The signet caught the light again. He looked at the small gold lion as though he were seeing it for the first time. There is a fourth thing, he said. Speak it. Eleanor will write a letter tonight. To her father. I know it as I know my own hand. She will write that she has accepted she is not wanted, and she will ask his leave to come home to the cottage at Marlow. Julian's mouth tightened. Then you must speak to her before the ink dries. No. Sebastian raised his head. Let her write it. Let her seal it. Let her give it to Whittaker, and let Whittaker bring it to me unopened. To what end? To the end that I shall read it on the morning of the ball, with the sapphires already in her hands, and a note in my own writing laid beside them. She has spent 28 months believing she was unseen. She will not believe a word I say to her now. She will only believe a thing she can hold. Julian considered him for a long moment. You have changed in an afternoon. No, said Sebastian. I have only at last begun. The door opened. Whittaker entered with a leather-bound ledger so large he carried it in both arms, and laid it on the desk between them, with the soft, heavy sound of a thing long hidden being at last set down in the light. He stepped back and waited. Sebastian opened the cover. The first page bore a date in the Dowager's careful hand, October the 2nd, 1815. Beneath it, in the same hand, a single line scored through in red. Requisition of the Duchess. 6 yards of cambric for personal use. Denied. Unnecessary for a heart. He turned the page. There was another, and another, and another. He turned pages for a long time. In the morning room at the far end of the house, Eleanor Hart sat at a small writing desk by a window that faced the south lawn. She had trimmed a fresh pen. She had unstoppered the ink. She had laid a sheet of paper square before her and written. In the neat, upright hand a governess had taught her at 12, the words, "My dear father." Beneath them she had written nothing yet. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the light move across the grass, and she did not weep, because she had passed, an hour ago in the blue salon, the place at which weeping is still possible. She had arrived at the colder country beyond it, where a woman picks up a pen and writes the sentence that ends a life and begins another. She dipped the pen. She did not yet know that, 3 rooms away, her husband had begun to turn the pages of a ledger that would, in 9 days' time, undo the woman who had taught him to call her bookkeeper. She did not know that he had heard. She thought, as she had been taught for 28 months to think, that she was entirely alone. She set the nib to the paper, and behind the green damask curtain in the empty blue salon, a single mote of dust drifted down through the late afternoon light and settled, like a verdict, on the rim of her abandoned cup. The nib scratched once, twice, and stopped. Eleanor lifted the pen, considered the half-written line, and laid the paper aside. The verdict of dust on her cup would wait. There were 3 days until the ball, and 3 days was not nothing. She rose, smoothed the gray muslin at her hips, and went to find the housekeeper. Mrs. Pell received her in the still room with a curtsy held a beat too long. The woman's eyes flickered past Eleanor's shoulder, as if expecting Lady Augusta to materialize from the press of dried lavender. "The flowers for Thursday," Eleanor said. "I should like to see the order." "Her Grace the Dowager has the order, madam." "Then I should like a copy." "There is no copy." Eleanor looked at her. She did not raise her voice. She did not move her hands from where they were folded at her waist. She simply looked, and the silence grew teeth. And after a long moment, Mrs. Pell wet her lips and said she would inquire. "Inquire by supper," Eleanor said, and left her. In the corridor, she met Harriet carrying a basket of linen. The girl's face was pink from the stairs, and pinker from something else. "Madam," Harriet whispered, "the list is up, on the morning room door, pinned with her crest." Eleanor went to the morning room. The card was vellum, edged in gold. 24 names ran down it in Lady Augusta's slanting hand. The principal hostesses of the evening grouped at the top. Lady Vauxhall headed the column. Beneath, in smaller letters, the receiving line, the Dowager Duchess, Lady Prudence Blackwood, Lady Vauxhall acting as hostess of the rooms in the absence of the Duchess of Ashfern, who was confined by indisposition. Eleanor read it twice. The second time she found her own name missing from every column it should have occupied. She was not on the receiving line. She was not on the list of presentations. She was not on the supper plan. She had been written out of her own house with a single phrase, "confined by indisposition." She did not touch the card. She turned, walked the length of the long gallery, and opened the door of the small library where she kept her account book. The book was gone. In its place, on the leather of the desk, lay a folded sheet in Lady Augusta's hand. Eleanor opened it. "The Duchess will understand that the season's expenses are now beyond her experience. Lady Vauxhall has consented to oversee the household disbursements until further notice. The Duchess is begged to keep to her rooms during the preparations, that her health may be preserved for quieter occasions." There was no signature. There did not need to be. Eleanor folded the sheet again along the same creases. She placed it on the desk where the account book had been. She stood for a moment with her palm flat upon it, and the pulse in her wrist beat once against the paper, and then she lifted her hand and went out. In the long corridor, a footman was carrying the silver épergne to the dining room. He passed her without bowing. She marked it. She said nothing. She climbed the great staircase. On the half-landing, she paused at the portrait of the third Duke and looked at the painted eyes a moment longer than was her custom. Then she went on. Her own apartments were warm. Harriet had built up the fire. The girl rose from the hearth, twisting a corner of her apron. "Madam, they sent the seamstress away." "Which seamstress?" "Madame Lefebvre, come from London with the blue silk. Her Grace the Dowager sent her back this morning. Said the gown would not be required." Eleanor walked past her to the dressing room. The wardrobe doors stood ajar. The blue silk was not there. In its place hung two of her older gowns, a muslin and a poplin, both gray, both clean, both patched at the elbows where she had patched them herself. The shoe rack held no dancing slippers. The drawer where her gloves were kept had been emptied to the long white kid she used for morning calls. She closed the wardrobe. She crossed to the small inlaid casket on the dressing table. The key was in the lock as she had left it. She turned it. The casket was empty. The sapphire parure her husband had given her on their wedding morning, the necklace of 7 graduated stones, the pendant earrings, the slender tiara of paste and Ceylon stones meant to be worn just once a season, gone. Her mother's ring of garnets, gone. The small pearl drops she wore to chapel, gone. Only the velvet remained, with the faint impressions where each piece had lain, like the prints of small absent animals. She closed the casket. She turned the key. She set the key on the table beside it. "Harriet! Madam, fetch me my writing case." The girl flew. Eleanor sat at the little Pembroke table by the window. The afternoon light was thin and silver, the kind that flattered nothing. She drew a clean sheet from the case, dipped the pen, and addressed it to Sir Reginald Hart, Briar Lodge, near Tetbury, Gloucestershire. She wrote 3 lines and stopped. She had meant to write that she was coming home. The phrase formed itself on her tongue and would not pass to the paper. Home was a damp parlor, and a father who lifted his glass with a shaking hand and called her "my dear," because he had forgotten, again, that she was a duchess. Home was the chair by the fire where she had sat at 18 and listened to him sign her away. Home was where the patching had begun. She set the pen down. A knock at the door, soft and three-toned. "Whitaker, come." He entered, carrying a small tray with a single cup of bouillon. He did not look at the writing case. He set the tray on the side table and turned, and his old eyes met hers for the duration of a single breath. And in that breath she read more sympathy than she had received in 2 years and 4 months. "Mr. Whitaker, Your Grace, did you remove the purser?" "No, madam." "Do you know who did?" He hesitated. It was not a hesitation of evasion. It was the hesitation of a man weighing what duty owed to which mistress, and finding the balance had at last tipped. "Her Grace the Dowager has placed the casket in the strong room," he said, "by her own hand. This morning, between 10 and the half hour." Mrs. Pell witnessed. "Thank you," he bowed. "Mr. Whitaker, the account book." "In the strong room also, madam." The seamstress turned at the gate, her fee paid out of the household purse, and a note pressed into her hand requesting her discretion. "By whose hand the note?" "Lady Prudence, madam, with her ladyship's own seal." Eleanor inclined her head. He bowed again and went out, closing the door behind him with the noiseless precision of 40 years' service. She sat very still. 3 days. A gown gone, the jewels gone, the book gone, the name struck from every list. She had become, in the space of a single morning, a guest in her own great house, and not a guest, for guests were greeted at the door. She had become a rumor, confined by indisposition. By Thursday night, the whole of the ton would have heard of her health. By Friday morning, they would have invented the malady. By Saturday, they would know its name. She rose and went to the window. Below, in the gravel court, a chaise was drawing up. Lady Vauxhall descended in primrose silk, a small spaniel under one arm, and was met by Lady Prudence with both hands extended. They embraced, they laughed. Lady Augusta appeared on the steps in her perpetual black and offered her cheek, and the 3 women moved together into the hall in a single rustling weather of skirts. Eleanor watched them go in. She watched the footman close the great doors. She watched a stable boy lead the chaise horses around to the mews, and the gravel court was empty again, and the light on it had not changed at all. She turned from the window. She would not write to her father. Not yet. To write to him was to lay the burden of her ruin on a man who had spent his ruin already and had nothing left to spend. She tore the 3 lines across, and across again, and dropped the pieces into the fire, and watched the paper curl and blacken and go. There remained the question of what she would do. She thought of leaving. She measured the practicalities as one measures a length of cloth. A post-chaise could be had at the Crown in the village by sunset. Her own purse held 12 guineas, the remainder of the quarter's pin money Sebastian had pressed upon her in January, and she had not spent. 12 guineas would carry her to Bath, where her aunt kept rooms above a milliner's, and her aunt's charity, though sour, was reliable. She would arrive at Bath on Friday. By Friday evening the ball would be over. By Friday evening the ton would have decided what to make of her absence, and the dowager's version would have set like plaster, and there would be no unsetting it. She thought of staying. To stay was to walk down the great staircase on Thursday evening, in a patched gray gown, and present herself at her own door, and be turned aside in front of 200 guests by a footman who had passed her without bowing. To stay was to give Lady Vauxhall the pleasure of receiving the curtsies that should have been hers. To stay was to stand at the back of her own ballroom and watch her husband, if he came down at all, lead Lady Prudence into the first set, because his mother had arranged it so, and because he had not, in 2 years and 4 months, arranged otherwise. She did not know whether he would come down. That was the cold thing. That was the thing she had not let herself name even in the privacy of her own thinking. She did not know whether Sebastian would come down. She crossed to the small writing desk and drew out a second sheet. This time she addressed no one. She wrote in her clear small hand, "I have stayed because to go was to grant her the victory. I have stayed because this is my house, given me by my husband on a March morning when the rain was on the roof, and a thing given cannot be taken by a list pinned to a door. I have stayed because if I am to be ruined, I will be ruined upright and in my own hall, and not in a post-chaise at a wayside inn. I have stayed because Thursday will pass, and Friday will come, and on Friday I will know what I am." She read it through. She folded it small. She placed it inside the locket at her throat, behind the lock of her mother's hair, and closed the clasp. Then she rang for Harriet. "The patched muslin," she said. "The dove gray, with the white cuffs. Press it for Thursday evening. The black ribbon at the waist. My mother's camafeo brooch. The white kid gloves. The long pair, with the small darn at the third finger. My hair plain, in a knot. No ornament." Harriet stared. "Madam, for the ball?" "For the ball. But the Dowager has said many things. On Thursday at 9 o'clock I shall come down the great staircase in the dove-gray muslin and present myself in my own hall. If I am turned aside, I shall be turned aside in the gown my husband first saw me in. There will be no mistaking who I am, or what has been done." The girl's eyes filled. She did not let the tears fall. She curtsied and went to the press. Eleanor sat down again at the Pembroke table. The light at the window had thinned to the color of pewter. Somewhere below, a clock struck the half-hour, and was answered by the deeper clock in the great hall, and then by the stable bell, and the three notes lay one upon the other and faded into the dusk. She thought of Sebastian. She had not seen him for 2 days. He had ridden out at first light on Monday with Lord Julian, and had not yet returned. The household believed him at the home farm. Lady Augusta said so at every meal. Eleanor had not contradicted her. There was no purpose in contradiction. Sebastian would return when he returned, and he would do what he would do, and the only piece of the matter that lay within Eleanor's hand was the gown she would wear when he did. A scratch at the door, lower than Whittaker's. "Enter, Mrs. Pell." She came in white about the mouth and held out a small folded note. "From Her Grace the Dowager, madam. To be read at once." Eleanor took it. She did not open it in the housekeeper's presence. She inclined her head, and Mrs. Pell, after a hovering moment, withdrew. When the door closed, Eleanor broke the wafer. "It is desired that the Duchess remove herself to the Dower House before Thursday noon, that the preparations for the ball may proceed without distraction. A carriage will be at the south door at 11. Trunks will be sent on. The Dowager begs the Duchess to consider how kindly this proposal preserves her dignity, which a public reverse in her own hall would not." A.B. Eleanor read it once. She did not read it again. She rose, crossed to the fire, and held the note over the coals. She did not drop it. She held it until the corner blackened and curled, and the flame ran up the page, and the wafer melted and dropped in a single bright bead into the ash. Then she let go of what remained, and watched it fall. The Dower House, 3 miles down the avenue, behind the Lime Walk, where the second Duchess had been sent in 1791 and had not been seen again until her funeral. The Dower House was not a retreat. The Dower House was a sentence. Eleanor stood at the fire a long while. When at last she turned, Harriet was at the press laying out the patched muslin, smoothing the bodice with the flat of her hand. The girl looked up. Their eyes met. Eleanor crossed to the press, took the brooch from its small box, and laid it on the breast of the gown herself. 11 o'clock tomorrow, she said quietly. A carriage will come to the south door. I shall not be in it. Madam, if anyone asks for me before Thursday evening, I am in the morning room, at my correspondence. I am not indisposed. I am not in retreat. I am at my correspondence. Do you understand, Harriet? Yes, madam. Tell Mr. Whittaker. Yes, madam. The girl went. Eleanor remained alone in the dressing room with the patched gray gown laid out on the press and the empty casket open on the table and the dusk gathering at the window. She did not weep. There was nothing to weep with. She had used the weeping, years ago, on smaller things, and there was none left for this. She thought with great clarity that she had been wrong on the day of her wedding to imagine that the worst had been the signing. The signing had only been the beginning of the patching. The worst was this, to stand in one's own dressing room on the eve of one's own ball and choose with care the gown in which one would be turned away at one's own door. She crossed to the window and laid her palm flat against the cold pane. Beyond the glass, the Lime Walk ran down into the gathering blue, and the Dower House lay at the end of it, low and dark among the bare trees, with no light in any window. She did not know that 3 corridors away, in the strong room behind a door of oak banded with iron, The sapphire perusure lay in its velvet against the leather of the account book, both of them within an arm's reach of a man who had ridden 2 days without rest and had come in by the kitchen stair an hour before, and who at that moment was turning the key in the lock with a hand that was perfectly steady and a face on which there was no expression at all. She drew her palm from the pane. The print of it faded slowly from the cold glass, and when it was gone she let the curtain fall, and the room behind her was very quiet, and the patched gray gown on the press caught the last of the light, and held it, and would not let it go. The morning of the ball arrived without ceremony. Eleanor was awake before the maids, sitting at the small writing desk in the dressing room, the unsealed letter to her father lying on the blotter where she had left it the night before. She read it once more, slowly, and saw that her own hand had been steadier than her heart. She folded it. She did not seal it yet. Outside, the corridor was already full of small noises. Florists arrived through the side gate. A cart of ice rattled across the cobbles. Somewhere below, a maid was scolded for dropping a tray. Ashfern Hall was preparing itself for 200 guests, and not one of them, by Lady Augusta's careful arrangement, expected to be greeted by the Duchess. Harriet came in with the morning chocolate and stopped at the threshold. "Your Grace," she said, "Mr. Whittaker asks if he may be admitted. He has something with him." Eleanor laid the letter flat against the wood, face down. "Show him in." The old butler entered with the slow precision of a man who had carried heavier things than a single velvet box, though his arms held only that. The box was deep blue, long enough to lie across both his gloved hands. He set it upon the writing desk with great care, as if the wood itself might bruise. "From his Grace," Whittaker said. Eleanor did not move. "He gave instruction," the butler went on, "that the box be delivered at this hour, into your hands, and into no others. There is a note." He produced an envelope from inside his coat. The seal was the Ashfern sigil, pressed deep and dark into red wax, the lion and the sword still warm in the impression. Eleanor took it. She did not break it at once. She looked at the box, then at Whittaker, then at the box again. "Open it, Your Grace," he said softly. "If you would." She lifted the lid. The morning light, thin as it was, found the sapphires and made them speak. The full parure lay against white silk, the collar, the long pendant earrings, the tiara that had been her mother-in-law's by marriage, and the late Duchess's by birthright, and Eleanor's by neither for 2 years and 4 months. Beside it, in its small velvet groove, was the ruby ring her father had pawned in the second winter, the one she had told no one about except in a letter Sebastian had never been meant to read. Her fingers did not tremble. They simply stopped, as if the air around them had thickened. She broke the seal. The hand inside was his, sharp and small and unmistakable, the writing of a man who did not waste ink. "Wear the blue gown. Come down at 9. I will be there." Below it, in the same precise script, 3 further words. "I heard everything." Eleanor read the note twice. Then she folded it once, set it inside the velvet box beside the tiara, and closed the lid. "Tell his Grace," she said, "that I shall be punctual." Whittaker bowed. At the door he paused, and for the first time in many months, Eleanor saw the old man's mouth move into the smallest line of something not quite a smile. "He has heard everything, Your Grace," he said, "for some time." Then he was gone. She sat for a long moment with her palm flat upon the closed lid of the box. The velvet was warm where his note had lain. She thought of the night by the sealed window, of the count of feet in the corridor, of the carriage hour she had set for herself and would now uncrown. The hour did not need her anymore. The carriage could wait for someone else, on some other estate, on some other night that would not come. She rose. She crossed the room. She unlocked the writing desk drawer and took out the ruby ring her father had pawned, the one that had come back to her now without any explanation she had asked for, and she slid it onto the smallest finger of her right hand. The stone sat where it had always sat. It was warmer than she remembered. Eleanor turned the unsealed letter face up on the blotter. She did not read it again. She tore it slowly across the middle, and then across again, and laid the pieces into the cold grate. She did not light them. They could wait until evening. The day passed in a long, strange quiet. Lady Augusta sent no summons. Lady Prudence did not come to the morning room. Twice Eleanor heard the dowager's voice in the corridor, brisk and pleased, directing footmen to set the receiving line in the blue saloon and to reserve the place at the head of the stairs for Lady Vauxhall. The arrangements continued precisely as the dowager had ordered them. No one had told her otherwise. At noon, she walked the long gallery alone. The portraits of the Blackwood line watched her go by, as they had always watched, and she found that she no longer flinched beneath their painted regard. The late Duchess in her wedding ivory looked, for the first time, like a woman and not a verdict. Eleanor paused beneath the frame. She inclined her head, courteously, as she might have done to any predecessor who had also been required, in her time, to learn this house. Then she went on. In the still room, the housekeeper was counting candles into baskets, her hands trembling with the sighs of the evening. She did not see Eleanor at the doorway. Eleanor watched a moment, then quietly withdrew. The house was moving towards its hour. The house did not know yet that its hour would not belong to the woman in perpetual black. In the library, Eleanor took down, almost without thought, the ledger she had been forbidden to touch. It was no longer forbidden. She did not open it. She set her palm upon the leather and felt, beneath the cool grain, the rule of the lines she had not been allowed to draw. She put the ledger back. There would be time, in the coming weeks, for ink of her own. At 4, the blue gown was brought up from the locked press in the east wing. Eleanor did not ask who had unlocked it. The silk had the deep, drowned color of evening water. Harriet laid it across the bed and stood beside it with her hands clasped, breathing as if she had been running. "Your Grace," she whispered. "Oh, Your Grace." "Dress my hair down," Eleanor said. "Loose, in waves." The dowager said, pinned. "Your Grace, if you were to be dressed at all," she said, pinned and small and loose, Eleanor said, "in waves." Harriet curtsied and went for the warming irons. At 8:45, the carriages were already in the drive. Eleanor stood at the long mirror in the dressing room and looked at the woman in the glass. The sapphire collar lay cool against her throat. The pendant earrings caught the candlelight and threw it back in small blue stars. The tiara sat without weight upon her unpinned hair. The silver embroidery on the overskirt moved when she breathed. She did not recognize herself. She recognized, instead, the woman she had been before the ruby ring went into the pawnbroker's drawer. A soft knock. The door opened. Sebastian stood in the threshold in black evening dress, the white linen at his throat very plain, the signet ring on his smallest finger catching the lamp. He did not come in. He looked at her once, fully, from the hem of the gown to the crown of her hair, and the color went out of his face and came back again. "Your Grace," he said. "Your Grace," she answered. He offered his arm. She laid her gloved hand upon it. They walked, without haste, to the head of the grand staircase. Below them, the blue saloon was full. 200 guests in court dress and feathers, the candles in the great chandeliers throwing light upon ivory shoulders and gold braid. Lady Augusta stood at the foot of the stairs in her perpetual black, leaning lightly upon her ebony cane, her white silver coil severe under the lace cap, Lady Prudence at her elbow in rose-violet gauze, the gigot sleeves enormous, the painted fan working slowly. Lady Vauxhall, in cream and pearls, was already half a step forward, ready to receive the first announcement of the evening as hostess. The major domo struck his staff 3 times upon the marble. "His Grace the Duke of Ashfern," he called, "and Her Grace the Duchess." The room turned, the room saw. Lady Augusta's fan stopped. It did not fall. It simply stopped, mid-arc, an inch from her cheek, as if the air had set around it. Lady Prudence made a small sound and shut her own fan with a sharp click that traveled further than she intended. Lady Vauxhall took the half-step back that she had been about to take forward. Sebastian and Eleanor descended. They did not hurry. The silver embroidery moved. The sapphires breathed. At the foot of the stairs, Sebastian did not turn to his mother. He did not turn to his sister. He turned to the room. "My friends," he said, and his voice was low and very clear, and went into every corner without effort. "Before the evening proceeds, the House begs your patience for 2 announcements. Both, I hope, brief." He let the silence settle. It settled at once. The first concerns the management of this estate. For 2 years and 4 months, the household accounts of Ashfern Hall have been administered, in the absence of my attention, by my mother, the Dowager Duchess, and by my sister, Lady Prudence. A review of the ledgers, conducted by Mr. Whittaker and confirmed by my solicitors in London, has established that during that period the Duchess's personal allowance, her stipend for charitable subscription, her quarterly funds for dress and correspondence, and a dowry portion of £12,000 settled upon her at marriage have been struck through, withheld, or redirected in their entirety. The marks of these revisions are in my mother's hand. The accountings are documented. The matter is not in dispute. Lady Augusta's lips parted. She did not speak. The ebony cane shook once against the marble, and then was still, because she had willed it still. Effective tonight, Sebastian continued, the Dowager Duchess and Lady Prudence are removed from any administrative function within this house. They will withdraw to the dower property at Treville in Cornwall, where a pension proportionate to a widow's portion and a sister's right will be paid quarterly through my London bank. The dowry of £12,000, with interest computed from the date of marriage, is restored in full to the Duchess as her own settled income, to be drawn upon her signature alone. Mr. Whittaker holds the papers. They are signed. A murmur began somewhere in the back of the room, and was at once shamed into silence by the better-bred half of the ton, who knew an execution when they saw one, and had the manners to watch it without sound. Lady Prudence's painted fan slipped from her fingers. It struck the marble with a small painted clatter. Nobody bent to retrieve it. "That," Sebastian said, "is the first announcement." He turned. Then, and for the first time that evening, he looked at his wife in the full light, with the whole of the room as witness. The second is shorter. He stepped back from her arm. He sank, in the center of the polished floor, onto one knee. His coat-tails fell forward across the marble. The signet ring caught the chandelier. "Your Grace," he said, "I have failed for 2 years and 4 months to see what was placed in my hand. I have heard, in the last weeks, every word that was spoken against you in this house, and I have heard, before that, every silence in which I should have spoken for you and did not. I cannot undo the silence. I can ask, before this company and before God, that you grant me the first waltz of this evening, and the second, and every waltz thereafter that this life affords." Eleanor looked down at him. She did not weep. She did not smile too quickly. She let the room wait, because the room had earned its weight. "Rise, Your Grace," she said at last, and her voice was steady and audible to the last footman at the door. "You shall have the waltz." He rose. The orchestra, which had been holding its breath in the gallery, struck the first long sweep of the strings. He led her to the center of the floor. The guests parted as if a tide had been told where to go. Lady Augusta did not move from the foot of the stairs. Lady Prudence stood beside her, the rose-violet gauze suddenly garish under the candles, her painted fan still on the marble at her feet. By midnight a carriage would be waiting in the side court for them, and by morning the road to Cornwall would have them, and the Tun would speak of it for a season and then of other things, because the Tun always did. But that came later. Now the music began. He set his hand at her waist. She laid hers upon his shoulder. They turned once, slowly, into the first measure of the waltz, and the sapphires moved with her, and the silver in the overskirt caught the light, and the room, after a beat of held breath, began at last to breathe. From the foot of the stairs, Lady Augusta took at last one small step backwards, and then another, as if the marble beneath her had become uncertain. Lady Prudence, who had never in her life been without a sentence prepared, opened her mouth and shut it again. A footman, well-trained, moved at once to her elbow with the courtesy that is paid to ladies who are about to leave a house. She did not strike him away. She let herself be turned. The painted fan stayed where it had fallen, and a guest in dove-gray silk stepped delicately around it, and the music carried. He bent his head a little so that only she would hear. "You were the only one," he said, "who ever truly saw this house for what it was. Forgive me that I was the last to see you." She did not answer in words. She tightened her gloved fingers upon his shoulder, once, and that was answer enough. They turned. The candles burned. The night went on. Long after the last carriage had rolled from the drive, long after Whittaker had locked the great doors and the footmen had snuffed the chandeliers, Eleanor walked alone through the blue saloon in her stocking feet, the sapphires laid aside upstairs, a single shawl about her shoulders. She came to the long window that gave upon the eastern garden, the one she had pressed her brow against on the night she had meant to leave. She drew the curtain back. The glass was cold. She did not press her brow to it this time. She set her open palm against it instead, fingers spread, and held it there until the warmth of her hand bloomed upon the pane and stayed. Upstairs, in the dressing room, the patched gray gown still lay folded on the press, where Harriet had left it that morning, holding the last of an older light. She would not throw it away. She would lay it, in the morning, into the bottom of the cedar chest, beneath the linen and the lavender, where a woman keeps the proofs of what she has survived. A daughter, perhaps, would one day lift it out and ask. There would be an answer ready for her. She had not been seen, for 2 years and 4 months, in any room of this house. She had been seen now, and that, in the end, was the only inheritance that had ever been worth the keeping. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever sat quietly mending what others tried to tear, while the people closest to you struck your name from their lists in red ink? Has someone you love ever been called the mender behind a curtain, when in truth, they were the only one holding the house together? And when justice finally walked down the staircase in sapphire silk, did you recognize the patience it took to wait for it? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, justice, and love that arrives against all odds, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.